Representatives from about 170 countries took part in a historic signing ceremony at the UN on Friday. A moment in history, said the Secretary General, who added, "We are in a race against time." China was one of the first countries to sign, with Vice Premier Zhang Gaoli attending as a special envoy on behalf of Chinese President Xi Jinping. The Vice Premier said that China would finalize legal procedures to ratify the Paris Agreement before the G20 summit, which takes place in China in September. And he also stressed China's commitment to achieving its climate goals.
We will take effective actions at home to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. China has set the target of achieving the peaking of carbon dioxide emissions around 2030 and making best efforts to peak early. And relevant actions have been incorporated into our national development plans.
Well, joining me now from New York, where he's been covering the event at UN headquarters, is CCTV correspondent Nathan King. And Nathan, how historic and significant was the signing ceremony?
Quite historic, considering where we've come from, Anand. Remember back in 2009, the Copenhagen Climate Summit, which ended in division and rancor, not least between the US and China, basically the developed and the developing world, pointing fingers about the past and also the way forward. And now we are seeing a coming together of 175 countries. In fact, the US and China really leading the way with their agreement for China to cap emissions by 2030 and the US at the same time to bring them down before the Paris summit. And that really helped ink the deal. Remember, both of them are accounting for 40% of global emissions just between them. So that was a historic deal which laid the path to towards where we are today. But remember, this is historic in that all these countries, 175 now, have agreed that they want to cap global temperature growth to 2 degrees centigrade or below, ideally 1.5, and raise $100 billion a year by the year 2020 to help developing countries mitigate the effects of climate change that's already happened and pave the way for renewable energy as well. So everyone being on the same page really does help. Now, of course, it isn't over yet, but the fact that we've come out of Paris and that we have this signing ceremony and so many have joined on, it won't, by the way, become official until 55 countries or 55% of emissions are accounted for, but we are on the road.
Nathan, now comes the hard part, implementation. What about implementation, and what do you see as some of the stumbling blocks ahead?
Right, well, there's a difference between agreeing and signing and joining. And we've had the agreeing in Paris, we've had the signing here, but the joining means ratification, a lot of times through domestic parliaments that are divided, not least here in the United States, for example, where it's actually a Paris Agreement, largely because it couldn't be a treaty, because then it would have had to go through the US Senate for ratification. So this is an executive action here in the US. A change of presidency, and there are already legal challenges as well, could actually make the US commitments unimplementable. And it's not just the US. India has a big problem with its national parliament. As you know, big cities in India are among the world's most polluted. The Ganges is the most polluted river in the world. And European countries also having a big problem necessarily getting it through their parliament. And then, of course, there's the trust issue. If some countries start to pull back, why don't other countries? So it really is a very, very difficult thing to get everyone on the same page. The one uniting thing, though, is that climate change does not happen in a vacuum. If the world's temperatures go up, it affects everyone on the planet, so everyone has to act.
Thanks, Nathan. That's CCTV's Nathan King reporting from New York. And now for more, joining me from Beijing is Changhua Wu. She is chair of the China Redesign Hub and was previously the Greater China Director of the Climate Group. Also with us from California is Chris Field. He is a professor of environmental studies at Stanford University. Joining us from New York is Renato Redento-Constantino. He is the executive director at the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, and he is also a board member of the Philippine People's Survival Fund. And with me here in the studio is Tara Huska. She is U.S. Director for an environmental activist organization called Honor the Earth, and she's also a special advisor to U.S. presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. Welcome to all of you to the show. Wu, let me start with you. We just heard the Chinese Vice Premier there tell us a moment ago that China will finalize legal procedures, sort of ratify these agreements that have been made before the G20 summit, which will take place in China in September. What impact is this going to have on China?
China is very serious about its commitment, as the Vice Premier said in New York, and China has started taking actions domestically. It's already fully reflected in the 13th Five-Year Plan, which was just adopted actually last month in Beijing. In it, China's commitment to the Paris Agreement, including the capping around its emissions around 2030, including energy intensity target, the carbon intensity target, and also aggressive targets around the development of renewable energy sectors. So in China, it's pretty much sort of already built into the domestic process in order to get ready to deliver its goal and commitment to the international process. So China is absolutely serious about it. In the meantime, actually, China also recognizes its role in the international or global governance around the global challenges like climate change. And so besides its own domestic efforts, China is also playing a more active role in the international community, particularly forming strong partnership with the U.S., in the meantime trying to bring all the others together. So the commitment actually to the international community before G20, China said we're going to adopt that for legally actually in China, and China will definitely be there and honor its commitment, having it integrated into domestic legislative framework before September.
Chris, the United States is hoping to join formally the agreement later this year. When that happens, what are the implications for the United States? And, what kind of obligations does this put on the United States?
A really interesting feature of the commitments that the U.S. made for the Paris Agreement, 26 to 28% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by 2025, is that most of the pieces for that are already embedded in executive actions that have already occurred, whether they're for energy efficiency or the Clean Power Plan or for other steps that have already been taken or woven increasingly into the fabric of the U.S. energy profile. But as you know, many aspects of the U.S. energy future are still unclear, including legal challenges to the Clean Power Plan. As those things work through the court, we'll see how difficult or straightforward it'll be for the U.S. to comply. What we can say at this point is that the U.S. is on track, and the extension of the tax credits for renewables plays an important role in the U.S. ability to keep up with the early stages of the components of the Paris pledges.
Renato, the broad goals of the deal is to cut emissions and to restrict the rise in global temperatures to 2%, hopefully 1.5%. Is that going to be enough?
First of all, the deal for vulnerable countries is about a temperature goal that is not well below 2 degrees. It's not about 1.9 or 1.8 or 1.7. For vulnerable countries like the Philippines and a lot of others, it's about 1.5, which is not a mere aspirational goal. It is a matter of survival. And 1.5 is going to be the yardstick by which we can say whether implementation of the Paris Agreement has been successful or not. It spells a difference between far more suffering, needless suffering, and the loss of lives and livelihood, or a chance to stabilize our future and eventually help developing countries to reach their sustainable development goals.
Right, there has been talk, Renato, about what would happen if that goal is not achieved, because you would have island nations which could go underwater. You'd have serious problems with food production around the world. Do you think that developed countries around the world are aware of these problems, aware of the urgency with which they must be tackled? The awareness level is growing. It's not growing fast enough, but it is growing. People's movements are making their voices increasingly heard, and governments are taking notice now more than ever before. The impacts are undeniable. If you look at the examples of extreme weather events in the United States or in the Philippines or in Fiji, these are taking place with just a 1 degree temperature rise relative to pre-industrial levels, just 1 degree. Imagine what would happen if we breach the 2 degree level, if we go above 1.5. The issues about hunger, about health,
about the massive impacts, the hits that economies will take, hitting the poorest hardest. These are undeniable, and I am hopeful that movements around the world, from the United States and Europe to Asian and African and Latin American countries, will make their voices heard, and governments will continue to do the right thing. Today has been a really, really important day. It's a morale booster because you have 175 countries, the largest ever in history, to come together in one day to sign an international agreement. That gives us hope, but also it reminds us of sobering realities, that decisions that were taken in December in Paris and today should have been made a decade ago. We have very little time and we need to act urgently.
Tara, as we heard there from NATO, today is an important day. We also heard from our reporter telling us how historic and significant this signing ceremony is. I want you to take a listen to what the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry had to say at the signing ceremony. Let's watch.
Indeed, even in the time since we convened in Paris, we have seen new evidence of the danger that the climate change pace poses to our planet. We learned that 2015 was the hottest year in recorded history by far. And we learned that after knowing that the past decade was the hottest on record.
Do you sense that there is urgency now in the United States on getting on board?
I think that we've finally reached the point where we're at least talking about it. We still do have a Congress that has members that believe climate change is not, they're climate change deniers. But I think with this presidential election, we've actually seen climate become a very central piece of what the Democrats are arguing about, right? I mean, it's something that's included now in almost every single debate. The U.S. is aware and understands that we have communities in Alaska that are going underwater. We have communities in Louisiana that are actually having to recede and go back. Climate change is something that's happening right now. And the actions that we take are directly impacting our futures. And so I think the American public has become very aware of it, and it's something that our lawmakers in turn are now becoming, more vocal about.
When you say it's part of the election debate, has it got beyond political point scoring into the realm of actually we need to do something about this? We need to actually formulate detailed policies on it?
I mean, there are definitely members of Congress that have introduced legislation that is absolutely geared towards that. There's very comprehensive pieces of legislation that are sitting there. Unfortunately, it does remain a very political issue. And, I haven't really seen a whole lot of movement on things that we really should be addressing. I mean, the Climate Change Accord is something, or the Paris Accord is, a really great model document, but it's something that we actually need to do. Just talking about it, that's great that we've taken that step, but we actually need to do something about it. Right. And I'm hopeful that we can push our legislators to actually take those steps and represent the people.
Wu, China and the United States account for something like 40% of global emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, this deal comes at a time, and China's been pushing very hard for it, but at the same time, we have the Chinese economy that is slowing down. Can China grow its economy and at the same time meet these obligations under this deal? I mean, how big a challenge will that be for China?
The current economic slowdown, which is sort of fortunate, but from the carbon emissions side, actually, it's a plus. It's plus in a way that China does not need to grow that as much as before, and we are not growing at the double-digit number anymore. And so when you do not need that much, actually, you do not consume as much fossil fuel as before. So that's a bigger context, which is sort of unfortunate, but also become the driver for change, for transformation. So what's happening now, basically, everyone trying to figure out how to build up or develop a new economic growth engines or drivers, particularly around clean technologies, renewable energy, electric vehicles, and you name it, actually. And hopefully through that process, through the technology innovation, through the policy incentives, we'll be able to build up a brand new economy. And in that process, we can pretty much deliver the decoupling of economic growth and energy, particular fossil fuel energy consumption there. China's record has already demonstrated the decoupling is already a trend. And now with the technology progress, with the cost of technology is actually dropping down very fast. And now we have a better chance to build up a new clean economy without really emitting as much as greenhouse gases before. So there is a hope today. In the meantime, actually, China is also furthering opening up and joining hands with the international community, particularly the United States, with the two largest economies in the world determined to transform their economy, shifting the development paradigm. You can pretty much sure the world economy is shifting towards a low-carbon future. So that's where the hope is.